All right. So what Noradu Zawagwegu. We're back. This is the fourth podcast. Back since before the holidays, I believe. Right? I think
Yeah.
so. Yeah. Yeah. So we have these two gentlemen on with us again today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we're about to have. And Deiwize's got some interesting facts and just a lot of ideas, and
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a really interesting, not only for myself, because I'm coming in here just like everybody else, and for the most part, like I don't know all the facts, and I'm just learning. So I hope everybody else gets to learn with me. And so yeah, if you want to go through the
Before we get to the premise,
yeah,
I have to share my
Yes.
usual disclaimer.
true.
I'm a student myself. I'm in the process of learning. I don't know everything. I don't claim to know everything. And I'm here today just to share what I've learned so far. And that might change, just like anything else, right? So I think I usually say that I like to look at our history and culture as a jigsaw puzzle, and that we see that a lot of pieces come in the form of written record. We see a lot of pieces come in the form of oral tradition, and what we try to do is piece those puzzle pieces together so that we might be able to compare and contrast information so that we could have a more complete impression of what we're looking at. So what I'm going to talk about today is a perfect example of trying to find as many puzzle pieces as we can, see what kind of fits together so that we might have a clearer impression of what this episode is really all about. So with that disclaimer out of the way, and I encourage everybody to do their own research and come up with your own conclusions. I think one of the main purposes of doing a podcast like this is to stimulate conversation. What did you say John Mohawk used to say?
Every time I'd get one of his talks or presentations, he'd often, when he was talking about some issue that he felt was maybe controversial at times, or there needed more, he'd say we need to continue, or we need to have that discussion on whatever that is. That discussion needs to happen.
Yeah.
And I have always remembered that, to the point of maybe too many times to also hear telling him that. I always say, "Oh well," and he go, "Wait a minute. We need to have that discussion, right?"
Yeah.
Let's stop him right away.
So stop it right away.
But that's right. You're right.
But I think that those forums where those happen, it's so true that we can't be afraid to bring these up, to maybe challenge a little, to open our minds up. I think that's really what it's about.
Yeah. So definitely what we're doing here today, we're having that discussion.
Yeah.
And today's discussion is going to focus on the infamous St. Lawrence Iroquois theory, and I guess some research I've been doing over the past few years on that particular topic. I guess what I'll do to open it up is explain a little bit about why I started going down that rabbit hole. And I think the story begins when I first started working here back in 2007, 2006. And Pointe-à-Calière Museum in the old port was having an exhibition on the St. Lawrence Iroquois. And it was a little bit awkward because some people from the Pointe-à-Calière Museum came here asking us kind of at the last minute if we would endorse what the exhibition was all about. And there was a publication that had come out by archaeologists from the Montreal area named Roland Tremblay. He was a good guy, by the way. I have nothing bad to say about Roland. He's a good guy. But the book really centered around the idea that the St. Lawrence Iroquois were a distinct Iroquois nationality. And when I say distinct, it meant that they're distinct from the Kanien'kehá. So we all in this community and other Kanien'kehá communities long held the idea that this is our traditional territory, always has been our ancestral lands. So, but we've seen in recent years this theory pick up steam. And I guess this Pointe Callière exhibition and book that was released at that same time was a challenge to this long-held belief that this has been our homeland. So unfortunately, it led to a not-so-great relationship with the folks at Pointe Callière. But that was really my first plunge into that debate. And then fast forward a little bit to 2016, Kahnawà was celebrating its 300th anniversary, and when we were trying to figure out different activities for the community to do, the cultural center was looking at maybe making a pamphlet on the 300th anniversary. I was tasked with developing that, and as I was doing research, it became a little bit more than a pamphlet. So it turned into an ongoing project to chronicle the origins of our community. And that kind of leads into the past few years we've been seeing, probably because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we've seen a huge amount of land acknowledgements that take place throughout Canada. If anybody doesn't know what a land acknowledgement is, it's when an entity honors the original inhabitants of that land. And so here at the Cultural Center, I dread Mondays, because Mondays is when all the requests come in for land acknowledgements.
Really,
Yeah. From all over the place. So I'll share, I'll be honest in saying that I'm not crazy about land acknowledgements.
Right.
I think it's the least any entity could do, short of giving the land back, right?
Yeah.
So what we do here at the Cultural Center is we remind them that our primary clientele is Kahnawà, and that it shouldn't be up to our organization to correct the problem.
Yeah.
Sure. But we do review land acknowledgements, and we toe the line here to say, if anybody asks, we use the phrase that this area, Montreal, St. Lawrence, River Valley, is the ancestral territory of the Kanien'kehá Nation. And sometimes that's a little bit too strong of terminology than they really want, because, that begs the question, what about the Wendots?
Yeah.
What about the Algonquins that lived in this area?
Yeah.
What about the St. Lawrence Iroquois?
KOR.
So a lot of Quebecois especially challenge the idea that this is ancestral Kanien'kehá territory for various reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So for us to offer any kind of feedback to land acknowledgement text, we have to toe the line and say, if you don't like what we're saying, then don't ask.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I think a lot of these entities expect us to be a shield in case of anybody attacking that land acknowledgement. And I use the Montreal Canadiens, for example. They were bold enough to say in their land acknowledgement that this was the ancestral territory of the Kanien'kehá Nation. And then they got bombarded by a lot of Quebecois who said, it's the St. Lawrence Iroquois, it's the Hurons, it's the Algonquins. So I think the Canadians were in a predicament now they had to substantiate somehow these land acknowledgements. So anyway, being plagued by that every Monday, I had to develop some kind of form response to these challenges.
Yeah.
So I took it upon myself to continue the work I was doing on the origins of Kahnawà, but going back even further to substantiate that this territory has always been a part of our ancestors' homeland.
Yeah.
So that little land acknowledgement was a small part of the motivation.
Yeah.
It wasn't the main, to get the sense, but it was an example of the types of little things sometimes that crop up on a day-to-day kind of level.
Exactly. And you know, the thing about the St. Lawrence Iroquois theory is that it's easily weaponized politically, right?
Right.
So we've seen that in 1990, where they said, well, the Kanien'kehá who are claiming land rights in Kahnawà and Kahnawà don't really have these rights. They don't really have Aboriginal rights because they're not Aboriginal to Canada.
To Canada.
So it's easily used or weaponized politically by Quebec, Canada. So I think there's a little bit of a political motivation in surrounding colonial governments pushing that theory.
I think it would be more than a little bit of motivation. That's my sense and my feeling on it.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the main reasons, if you ask me. And I know you're being a little bit, trying to be a little diplomatic here because of you, but I don't have to be. And I think it's not at all. I don't have to be. That's their that's what they want.
Yeah.
They want to be able to say that. So, among other things, they can argue, that claims that this is, we don't owe you this or that or anything, or we don't have, would it be any kind of responsibilities to this or that or that. And that whole, hey, I'll say it, the people, we're the first ones here.
Yeah.
The French Canadian settlers, that we're actually the oldest ones living in this. Yeah. And that, it troubles me.
Or when the French came back after Cartier, there was the people here mysteriously vanished.
Yeah, there's nobody here.
That's the term they use, terra nullius, meaning that it's empty
land.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about this.
Can we explain that?
No, terra land.
Yeah, it's a Latin term meaning that the land is free.
Yeah.
It's empty.
Okay.
It's empty and it's ripe for the picking.
Okay.
So, like the doctrine of discovery is rooted in that this was terra nullius.
Terra nullius.
Not the only area. Okay. There were tons of other areas all over the Americas.
And if Ungwehue people weren't considered humans because they weren't Christians, so it added to the idea that this was terra nullius.
Okay, I didn't know. Yeah.
So the St. Lawrence Iroquois is the topic of discussion today, and in my in the past few years, I've gone down the rabbit hole trying to do as much research as I can, archaeology, linguistics, oral tradition, all of these things, and try to mesh it together and figure out, well, exactly what was going on here in prehistoric times. Mm-hmm. So I guess the best way to start is to talk about the theory itself and what it's rooted in. So previous to the 20th century, most ethnologists and anthropologists believed and deduced that the St. Lawrence River was the ancestral home of the Five Nations, of the Iroquois who would become the Five Nations. And some will even say that the Hurons and Iroquois were one people at one time. And something happened where they split into two tributaries. And then, some will say that it was solely the Kanien'kehá who lived at Montreal. Mm-hmm. So we see a lot of that information being shared in the late 1800s and around the turn of the century. But once we get into maybe the 1940s, there's emerging archaeologists who are looking at a lot of pottery motifs, especially Iroquois pottery motifs in St. Lawrence area, New York area. And they even come up with a sort of classification. I'll share it briefly, but I have to just qualify this by saying I'm not an archaeologist and I'm not sure if I even have these concepts down pat. But archaeologists define a woodland period of archaeology generally in this part of North America that spans from 1000 BC to 1000 in the Common Era. and they identify 3 geographic cultural groupings. There's Point Peninsula, which is along the St. Lawrence River. There's the Hopewell geographic region, which is like Mississippian area, Ohio River, like that kind of area. And then there's the Owasco, which is coming up from the south into New York State, like kind of around the Susquehanna River area. And some people believe that Iroquois people are the convergence of these 3 cultural groupings or geocultural groupings based upon solely archaeology. This is an archaeological concept. So if we look at Iroquois pottery as opposed to Algonquin pottery is coiled, or Iroquois pottery is kind of formed, and it has that very distinctive collar around the brim, the top of the pot, and it has certain motifs that are very Iroquois specific. So in the 1940s, a lot of archaeologists who are developing this classification system, this archaeological classification system, they do notice that pottery along the St. Lawrence River has a very distinctive feature in contrast to Iroquois peoples who are in New York State. So along the St. Lawrence River, on the collar, you'd see these kind of circles that were etched into the brim of the collar, and the absence of these exist in the New York State area. And behold, there's your justification that you have 2 separate, distinct indigenous nationalities. It's not enough to convince me.
I was feeling the same way.
I recall that when we engaged with the Pointe Callière museum folk here at the Cultural Center so many years ago, I presented the argument that any culture that is spread across a large geographical distance will have their material culture evolve at a different rate in one zone compared to another zone. I say, like, in modern terms, the material culture in Halifax is going to be different than material culture in Toronto or Edmonton. But they're all still Canadian, right? They're all still part of that political entity known as Canada. So the same concept could, presumably exist amongst Haudenosaunee peoples, that we would have a different material culture in the north than we would in the south.
Yeah. Just like you said, geographically, it makes sense to me, because you got certain things maybe in the north that are of more impact, more importance to the people living in that area. Maybe there are people that are doing a lot more, whatever it is, hunting or for certain animals. I'm not saying in this case, but those things could crop up more, for example, or certain kind of designs. Go further, they're not doing it quite as much, or they have a little bit, so they're going to focus on whatever. Just they're not sitting there, because we're in the further to the south, we're going to put this. It just kind of naturally happens, and that's where you see that. Like you might, like you use the idea of Halifax, you might have things that are more focused towards the sea.
Yeah,
they're doing things about the sea and the fish and so on. And you go over to Toronto and whatever, whatever, or Montreal or whatever, animals or whatever, something else that's important. So that makes sense to me, that there would be difference even within a people.
Sure. And I mean, what we're really looking at is just ornate differences. The construct of the vessels are identical north and south, so. The
knowledge on how to manufacture this vessel or whatever was exchanged. Yeah. And maybe came from the same, if you want to say a root or a base of knowledge.
Right.
So
from my understanding, the archaeological argument that advances the St. Lawrence Iroquois theory is rooted almost exclusively in pottery. I could be wrong, but from what I've researched so far, it seems like it's solely pottery. if we look at the archaeology of effigy pipes, Iroquois effigy pipes, the story is a little bit different. There's an archaeologist named, I think I have it here somewhere. His name was Anthony Wanderl, and he did some research on Iroquois pipe effigies, and what he discovered was there were distinctive differences between St. Lawrence area pipes and New York State area pipes, but we find a lot of St. Lawrence pipes being in New York State, especially in Mohawk, Oneida, and Onondaga territories in New York State. And the theory that he develops, if I'm regurgitating that information properly, is that because pipes were so closely related to political activity, because when you had a council, they were all smoking. All the chiefs were smoking when they would have these political councils. That it's possible that there were, how could I say this? It's possible that the St. Lawrence Iroquois were coming into New York State, possibly as the older people that gave birth to the Mohawk, Oneida, and Onondaga, their ancestors. It's possible that that's what's happening. And one of the other theories he has is that it's possible that whatever political organization that existed on the St. Lawrence made its way into the Mohawk Valley as Kanien'kehá, Oneida, and Onondaga make their way from the St. Lawrence into New York State. So his theory isn't so much that they're not related, it's that Mohawk, Oneida, and Onondaga might be later along the timeline, which is probably where I'm starting to lean more and more, and I'll bolster that argument as we go. But that's archaeology. By the time we get into the 1960s, it becomes a proper theory now. It moves from something called the Laurentian Iroquois to the St. Lawrence Iroquois, but by the 1960s, it becomes a pretty static theory now.
Most people have accepted it. Most
that's
archaeologists
what
is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Have said, well, that's way it's much like they did for many years about the Bering Strait theory.
That's it. Exactly.
Yeah, and then that's a given. Let's move on to something else.
It seems to start at the beginning of the 20th century. It picks up steam in the 40s, but by the 1960s, it becomes an accepted theory. But archaeology is just one part of that.
Right.
Linguistics is another part of that.
I was thinking of that.
And the linguistics is a little harder to ignore than or dismiss as the pottery argument is. So really, the root of St. Lawrence Iroquoian distinctive nationality, as far as linguistics goes, comes from a word list that was generated by Jacques Cartier in his voyages to North America in between 1534 to 1542. He had 3 voyages in all, and so it's said that the first group of people that he encounters in the Gaspé Peninsula were Iroquois-speaking people. The second voyage, it goes as far as Montreal, goes to the famous Hochelaga village, meets Iroquois people there, goes to Stadacona at Quebec, and then we'll probably get into a little bit more detail later on. But and he kidnaps people. He kidnaps some people and brings them back to France. So there's a word list that he had assembled from each of those experiences, and based upon, I guess, the linguistic information that's harvested from those words, an argument is put forward that coincides with the archaeology that the people who lived in the St. Lawrence were a distinct nationality that was separate from those nations that became the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, including the Kanien'kehá. But if we look at some linguists, some renowned linguists like Floyd Lounsbury, who specialize in Iroquois languages, I think maybe in the late 70s, he analyzes Cartier's word list, and he remarks that it's not so much that it's a distinct language that's being spoken, although it could be, but it seems that there's the presence of more than one Iroquois language being spoken. And that's echoed by Marion Methuen, who's also a linguist that specialized in Iroquois languages. She says the same thing, that it seems like there's more than one language, Iroquois language, being spoken, as opposed to a homogeneous, distinct St. Lawrence Iroquois language. I find that interesting. But she also remarks that part of the difficulty in learning about the words that Cartier had is that we don't know what areas they came from. It could be a dialect spoken specifically at Stadacona. It could be specifically at Hochelaga. It could be from the people who he kidnapped. We don't know exactly which words were with which area. So I think if they knew that, it would be more helpful in determining if it was a distinctive language or not. But those two ingredients really formulate the St. Lawrence Iroquois theory, the archaeology and the linguistics. Again, to me anyway, the archaeology is pretty easy to dismiss, but the linguistics is a little bit tougher. And, if we talk about archaeologists, we see this a lot in academia where a lot of academics try to outdo each other, and they're trying to make a name for themselves. So what we see in academia is that not everybody's agreeing on the conclusions and theories that are being developed by these archaeologists. So it's hard to trust a lot of that information.
I question a lot of these, to a large degree, because, you look at all of the whole, like I mentioned earlier, things like that Bering Strait theory. I won't go with, but now as time goes on, just as the years go on and as, more and more work, shall we say, is being done, there's more and more things being found out, pushing things further back, and changing the direction in some cases.
Yeah.
Rather than going from one direction down, it's sometimes it's like it's coming this way if there's any movement, or just as much.
Yeah.
Both ways.
Yeah.
So I remember reading a book. I can't even recall what it was, 20 plus years ago, and it was one of the things the guy said at the time, maybe 30 years ago. At the time, he said, he was foreseeing looking at the future. He said, at that point, he says, 99% of all of the work in terms of archaeology and those related fields were done in Asia and Africa. Asia and Africa. So, of course, they're going to find more. He said, maybe 1% or less was done in the Americas.
Yeah.
And that was 30, 40. And in that period of time, and he predicted that the more work that was done, it came out of this, that the more that things will be found that will change some of those accepted theories. So it's another thing that's just throw in that pot.
And ultimately, it's guesswork, right?
Yeah.
It's guesswork. Yeah. And for a good part of this guesswork, they're ignoring oral tradition.
Yes.
And if we look at a lot of primary sources, written record of stories that were recorded in the 1700s, which provide a memory, we'll get into that a little later, that provide a memory of our occupancy of the St. Lawrence, is ignored by these archaeologists. So anyway, that's the archaeology, that's the linguistics, that's the St. Lawrence Iroquois theory. So that leads us to the question, so who were the people who lived on the St. Lawrence River? So where I'd like to start is just about Iroquois peoples in general. So again, this Floyd Lounsbury, who I mentioned earlier, linguist, in the late 70s, he comes up with a linguistic theory that dates the Proto-Iroquoians. So when I say Proto-Iroquoians, the original Iroquoians, and he dates that as far back as 5,000 years ago, that the Proto-Iroquois emerged as a distinctive linguistic group that eventually gave birth to a northern tributary, a southern tributary. That would, if you go far up the line, you'd get to Iroquoian and Huron. And they, of course, he includes St. Lawrence Iroquois because he's not dismissing that as a theory, even though he outlines that the Cartier word list might be composed of more than one Iroquois language being spoken, but I don't think he dismisses the idea of the St. Lawrence Iroquois theory. It says he believes that the Wendat Hurons and the Five Nations probably emerged about 2,000 years ago, and that the Kanien'kehá emerged maybe about 1,000 years ago. Which, you know, if we often hear that the Great Law was established about 1,000 years ago. So if the Five Nations as a unit, you know, maybe we look back at 1,000 years in conjunction with the emergence of the Kanien'kehá as its own individual nationality.
And part, when you always think of the story of it, where did the peacemaker come from?
Yeah.
To me, if you were at a time and you're coming from that area of where there are Hurons, it would be an area you're more familiar with. There's more contact with you. You had some type of connection.
Yeah.
That you, it wasn't a place you necessarily completely feared to go.
Yeah.
There had to have been that. And what motivated him to come to this area? If there was no connection, no past or present, whatever connection of the time, likely he wouldn't have been so moved.
Right. But
things like that.
But even at the same time,
that's true.
In the story of the peacemaker, it says that some versions anyway say that he came from the Bay of Quinte area, which is north of of Lake Ontario. Yeah. So again, suggesting a presence of our ancestors being on the northern shore.
I think that's what I'm trying to say.
It didn't say that the peacemaker was a St. Lawrence Iroquois.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. He came from that area, and when people think that today, they go, well, whose land was that very recently, or who lived in that area more recently than, say, 400 years ago? Yeah. Well, it was the people classified as Hurons. Yeah. Wendats, excuse me.
Wendats, yeah. Well, in keeping in the science realm, I'm just gonna I guess paint a landscape to kind of as a backdrop to what I'm thinking the story is. So if we look at this area 10,000 years ago, it was covered in water. So there's two things. There's what they call the Champlain Sea, which is along the St. Lawrence into the. If you look at those tributaries, those rivers right now, Lake Champlain included, and if we imagine those swelled with water at one time, this whole area would have been underwater because of the last glacial age. So starting around and not only the Champlain Sea, but another phenomenon called the Lake Iroquois, which was, if we look at the Lake Ontario, if we look at that as being a swelled mass of water, well, that covered a good part of New York State as well, and the St. Lawrence. So a lot of this was covered in water. And around 10,000 years ago, that's when we start. There's a geographical term, I can't remember, or geological term, where after an ice age happens, that the ice had scraped up and pushes up the land. Yeah. But so not only is the water receding, but the land is being pushed up at the same time. I forget what that geological term is, or but that's what's happening. So we start seeing the water recede, and we start seeing the land come up. And what comes to mind is the creation story, right?
That's what I was thinking.
So, of course, our creation story begins with the world covered in water. And if we look at, let's say, the island of Montreal emerging in this phenomenon, it looks like it could be a turtle's back, you know. So, you know, I'm not saying that that's what that is. But what I'm doing is tying the possibility that there might be remnants of that memory when the world was covered in water embedded in our creation story. Who knows? It might be all just symbolism too, you know. So that's something that comes to mind right away. And in conjunction with that, and you'll see where I'm going with this in a minute, I also look at how corn, if we look at ethnobotany, we see how corn comes into this area. So I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but the original plant that gave birth to corn after, you know, thousands of years of evolution was something called teosinte. So teosinte becomes cultivated around 9,000 years ago, and makes its way from Mesoamerica northward into North America, and after again thousands of years, it evolves into the corn that we eventually know it. So we see it arrive in New Mexico around 4,000 years ago. We see it arrive in the Mississippi River Valley around 200 Common Era. So in the year 200, it arrives in New Mexico. In the Mississippi River, and eventually makes its way in two paths. This is important. Corn takes two paths to get into New York State, or it diverges. If you've ever heard of the city-state Cahokia, it's a Mississippian culture.
Illinois area.
You know, at its heyday, they
Illinois area.
Illinois area. It boasted a population of maybe 20,000 people, 30,000 people that lived in this Ungwe city-state at one time. Some people say that that's even the origin of where Iroquois people come from. But we know that corn makes its way as far as that area, and then it breaks up into two tributaries. One tributary makes its way in between Lake Erie and Lake Huron and goes up the St. Lawrence. And the other tributary stays underneath the Great Lakes and makes its way into New York State. That's important to remember. I'll get back to that in a minute. But as I'm looking at and reading about the scientific side of things, when you're looking at the Champlain Sea, Lake Iroquois phenomenons, everything was underwater, and how corn makes its way from the south into the north, it reminds me of a story, a Seneca story, and I'll tell the story as fast as possible and with not much detail. But there's a Seneca story that I think Arthur Parker chronicled, and in that story, it's about the origin of corn, and it talks about that there was a great flood that surrounded this one village at one time, and the people were besieged by these floodwaters, and it was so bad that they started to starve, and they were really poor. These people, they didn't know what to do, and then they heard somebody coming towards their lodge, and this woman comes into one of the lodges, and she comes in. She's a stranger. No one knows where she comes from, and so she's a very pleasant person and starts talking to the people there, and that night that she's there, they hear rain. Like the rain is really hard, almost like, you know, when you hear hail hitting the roof. It's like that. And in the morning, they look in the I guess there was these storage boxes that were outside the longhouses, and it was filled with kernels of corn. And the people were like, what is this? And discovered it was a food, and it started to sustain them. And as long as this woman was there, it rained corn.
Really?
So they were sustained, even though they were besieged by these floodwaters. And in time, the chief of that village marries this woman, and and as time goes on, his younger brother starts a rumor about her. I can't remember what it is, but it insults her.
Mm-hmm.
It insults her enough to leave the village, that she feels she's not welcome, and she leaves. And lo and behold, when she leaves, it stops raining corn. So now the people are in a bind. Not only did the chief of the village lose his wife, but now his people are starving again. So his mother, the chief's mother, says, you should go after your wife and try to bring her home. And maybe we could get back to having a good life again. And so he ends up he ends up getting on a canoe, and he paddles for a long time. And even says that, I believe he's going south, and he travels for a really long time until he arrives at land. And when he gets out of his canoe, he travels on foot for a long time until he comes across this enormous field of corn. And he makes his way through this cornfield, and in the middle of the cornfield there's a lodge that's there, and he goes inside, and it's his wife and his wife's mother. And so he apologizes to her to no end. I'm sorry for what happened to you. I'd love for you to come back. And I, honestly, I can't remember if she comes back with him or gives him corn to bring back. But by the time he makes his way back to the village, the water had dissipated. So it's land again. And when he gets back, he brings corn for them to eat, but she also taught him how to plant the corn, how to cultivate the corn. And that begins to sustain the people. So if you look at that story in comparison to the ethnobotany of how corn makes its way from the south into the north, if we look at the Champlain Sea story and the Lake Ontario, we see a lot of commonalities that maybe this story is taking place. It's a symbol for what was happening in reality, but it was taking place over a longer period of time. Mm-hmm. So instead of this being like a story that takes place in a few weeks, it's something that took place over hundreds of years. Maybe, and this is the way they commemorate that event, by telling it as a form of a story.
So oral tradition takes time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
but
you want to say something?
Did you want to jump in?
No.
But it matches something else, So we see a convergence of oral tradition and some of the scientific information of how this area becomes populated by corn planting peoples. Mm-hmm. But there's another story that kind of fits well here, and it's a story that was told to Father Lafiteau when he was stationed here in Kahnawà in between 1714, 1717. And he asks the people of Kahnawà if they recall their origin. And the people here say, oh yeah, we recall our origin. We came from the west originally, and we made our way as far as we could, presumably along the St. Lawrence, to what is presently known as Quebec. And he also says that they were led by a woman. This woman led them to this to the settlement at Quebec, present-day Quebec. But they found the growing season too short, and they decided to move and cold and inhospitable for planting. So they moved more south to the country that they called Iroquois, which is a French Huron way of saying Kanien'kehá, mm-hmm. So Mohawk territory. Mm-hmm. And the people here tell Father Lafiteau that the origin of the Kanien'kehá is different from the other four nations of the Haudenosaunee. They got to New York in a different way. So it could be, if we're looking at this pattern, the migration of corn, again, there was two paths, right? There was a path that came up in between Lake Ontario and Lake Huron and up the St. Lawrence. If we look at archaeological terms, that would be the Point Peninsula people. Yeah. And then if we look at the people coming underneath Lake Ontario and directly into New York State, who maybe have given birth to these the other four nations, while maybe they came from Hopewellian cultures, which was concentrated in the Mississippi area from Cahokia.
Cahokia, that's Hopewellian.
So, so that's a big speculation, but it matches. A lot of these stories are overlapping.
It's so to me anyway. It's really interesting to look at how, again, when you try to fit all these pieces. Some of them is climate change.
Yeah.
Some of it is which there is some evidence of some of that going on.
Yeah.
There's the evidence of the language. When you put it, and all of that, the stories, which are, again, as you sort of said, maybe it could have been over 100 years when it comes across in the story like it was maybe 3 months, or whatever. And so but to try to be able to fit that puzzle, you said, it's almost like a puzzle, which we probably will never really complete. We won't know for sure.
No, we'll never know.
But it to me, it just speaks about how there are so many different influences in some different directions and so many different amalgamations of ideas and cultural ways and etc. Language. It's I find it very interesting. That's this.
Yeah. Gives us a clear clearer picture, right?
And for people to be able to say, no, you're this and you're not. To me, it's you can't. Very difficult to do. It doesn't make any sense. Also, it doesn't make any sense because the influences, even today, we live. The culture that is around us that we're largely influenced by, that comes from so many different ways, so many different directions, depending on the people. Well, they come in and other people say, hey, we like that aspect of what let's make that part of our, we're all going to do hip hop now.
Well, that's the thing. We're not looking at history through glass. It's always changing. It's always
changing.
Right.
All right. So now I'm going to move into a little bit more on the development of the culture that lived along the St. Lawrence. So I mentioned that prior to the St. Lawrence Iroquois theory, one of the more prevalent theories is that the ancestors of the Haudenosaunee nations and the Hurons were one people at one time. And there were celebrated ethnologists, linguists, anthropologists that all really held fast to this theory, like Horatio Hale, William Lighthall, Lewis Henry Morgan. All of these guys really felt that that we were one people. Wendat and Haudenosaunee peoples were one people at one time, and the more I do research, the more I think that was the case, and I'll share some stories now to maybe bolster that idea. The one that really comes to mind is a story that was told to Horatio Hale in 1872 by a Wendat chief named Mandarog. I forget what his English name was, but he lived somewhere in the area with the Wyandots in Oklahoma. Wendat, they're the same. They're Huron people, just a different pronunciation. But Mandarog's story, he talks about the origin of the Huron and Iroquois, and he says that we were one people at one time, and he says that we lived by the mountain. He talks about being in Quebec, and but when we think about the mountain, for me anyway, I think of Mount Royal as the mountain. Yeah, there might be other hilly, mountainous areas in the St. Lawrence River Valley, but I'm leaning more towards him referring to Mount Royal. And he says that the first split that took place amongst this Iroquoian group of people was irreconcilable, and it resulted in two separate villages on both sides of the mountain. So you had one village who would become the ancestors of the Haudenosaunee nations, and you had another village on the other side of the mountain that would be the ancestors of the Wendat Huron people. They don't really say about what the reason they had split into two villages was, only that they would not communicate because they had a nice arrangement having two settlements, and if they would interact with one another, it would maybe spark that animosity again. So they were forbidden from having contact with each other, and definitely not allowed to marry one another. So lo and behold, a woman from the Huron, or the ancestors of the Huron village, marries an Iroquois man at the other village. But it's said that in the story that, according to this Mandarog, that the Iroquois man was very abusive, and he eventually killed this woman, forcing the two settlements to talk about how to administer justice in this situation. So the chiefs from both of these villages had a council, like a trial almost, to determine if this man was guilty of killing his wife. And the chiefs from both villages ended up siding with the Iroquois man, saying that either he was innocent or that he was in his right to kill her. I'm not making any judgments there. I'm just relating the story. But this didn't settle well with the wife's brothers, who wanted to avenge her death. So they went and they attacked the Iroquois man, or they went after him, and it sparked a conflict between these two villages. So if I remember right, they try to make peace again, and the Iroquois, again, this is a Huron that's telling the story. So he tells the story. He says that the Iroquois people trick the Hurons and attack them, and in that attack, force them from their village, and they start to retreat westwardly until they get to their Huron country. And when I say Huron country, I'm talking about that. Historians refer to it as the Pays d'Ao, where like Lake Simcoe, Lake Huron,
north of Toronto, that cottage country they call it.
Yeah, exactly. Today. So according to this story, that's where they were pushed, leaving the ancestors of the Haudenosaunee prevalent in the St. Lawrence River area. So that's one story about how it became that the Haudenosaunee occupied exclusively that area.
That's interesting story. It's coming from, you say,
and that's oral tradition.
Oklahoma, and it makes sense about geographically, when you know a little, it just does make sense that this would happen.
And that story was told in 1872. That's how old that story is. There's another story that I'll share with you concerning this, kind of the same idea, but it has to do. It comes from a man named David Cusick, who was a Tuscarora. His father was a chief, and this David Cusick claims that the stories that he relates came from his father, who got it from his father, and so on. So David Cusick, in 1825, writes a book called Ancient History of the Six Nations. It's often dismissed by academics as being over the top, and that he wasn't a real bona fide academic. So there's a little bit of that too. But in his story, and it is a little bit over the top if you read it, it's a little bit over the top. But he starts with his own version of the creation story, and he eventually moves into how the Six Nations break apart to form tributaries. So again, they were one people at one time that broke into smaller groups, just like the linguistic theory that there was a group of Proto-Iroquois that broke into different denominations or tributaries. He kind of says the same thing, and then he gets into his own version of the peacemaker story. But somewhere in between, I believe, before the Six Nations break up into these different denominations, the first group of people that came, that broke apart, came live at the St. Lawrence. And the coolest part, I think, of this, or two cool things. One is that the name, that the ethnonym that that he uses to describe these people, Proto-Iroquoians or whatever you want to call them, was Ungwehungwe. So in the absence of non-Indigenous people, what would have been the practical use of the term Ungwehungwe? What was it distinguishing? You know, so is it possible that Ungwehungwe was the ethnonym of the original Proto-Iroquoians? Which, and if you're looking at it in hindsight, it could, often, some people will translate it as original peoples. Is it talking about the original Proto-Iroquoian people?
Yeah.
No, this is all speculation.
That they all came from later.
Yeah, this is just speculation, you know, like this is just us having fun chatting.
Yeah.
You know, but pretty cool if so, right?
You're not putting it there as this is what actually happened.
Yeah.
This is somebody's version. Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the other cool thing is that when this tributary breaks off and comes live at the St. Lawrence, you know what they call it? Kahnawà. And this is, you know, this is him in 1825 telling a story that he says he got from his father and so on and so on.
Yeah.
But it supports the argument, and this is an argument that I'm putting forward, is that the original name of the country here was Kahnawà because of the river, because of the rapids. So, so Cusick tells this story of the original group of people who left the main group to come up here. He describes them as that the country was Kahnawà, that this place was called Kahnawà, or at least the river was called Kahnawà. That's supported, by the way, by Lewis Henry Morgan, who wrote the famous League of the Iroquois. In his research, he uses the term Kahnawà to describe the St. Lawrence River himself. Yeah, he calls it the Rapid River. But I submit to you that this country was called Kahnawà.
I used to. I know some of the work you've done, and some of the research you've done shows that there are at least two sites, at maybe a third, along the Mohawk River.
Yes.
Of Kahnawà.
Yeah.
And a little bit I've gone down the river a few times now. I didn't. Again, it's changed.
Yeah.
There's no doubt. There's a change, and there had to be.
Yeah.
Nothing that I saw there approaches the rapids in this area. This is, there's nothing nearby, to my knowledge, that I've seen in the eastern seaboard area, shall we say, that remotely comes.
There's no rapids.
There's no rapids there. Yeah. And then to say that was to go the opposite way, to say those were called Kahnawà, and then, no, I mean, it's possible, of course, but it seems to me it would be more the other way, because these are big rapids, and you would right away, that's the first thing you would say. If you had a village along somewhere there, and for example, that village could have also been on the other side.
Yeah. I got a theory for that.
Okay. It could have been. It could have been where what do you call it? Is that's the park there.
Yeah, I got a theory for that. I'm not going to spoil it right away.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No. It's good that you brought that up, because it reminds me. It reminds me. So I'm going to share something too, just quick about Billy Two Rivers. He used to tell a story that in the time of Cartier, that there were 3 villages in the area. There was a village that was on the island. I think he called that a Bear Clan village, and there was 2 on the south shore. One was by the Turtle River, which was a Turtle Clan village, and the other was at the Riviere de Loup, or Wolf River, or what's now known as the Chateauguay River, which would have been a Wolf Clan settlement that was there. But what's interesting is, in an interview with Billy Two Rivers, he says that it's a mistake that we limit the name Kahnawà to being the name of a village when it's the name of the area. And again, substantiating this idea that the name of the country up here, the North Country, was
much
Kahnawà.
larger than
That this is the place
the
of
whole
the
area.
rapid river.
Yeah.
And it goes back to that whole, when you look at things, if someone just comes here and looks at the geography, what's the two most outstanding features of this area are the mountain and those rapids.
Sure. Yeah.
They stand out.
Yeah. So and then also when Cartier comes here the third time in 1541, I think he leaves in 1542. I don't. It's a little bit complicated to explain, but there's a discrepancy on the third voyage, the record of the third voyage, because it was lost. The original transcript of Jacques Cartier's journal, or whatever you want to call it, was lost. But there was a British cartographer, I believe in the 1700s, who got his hands on it and transcribed it into English, and that survives. But some people will question, well, did he transcribe it accurately? Did he make it up? Whatever. But I'll tell you, one of the things that is noticeable about that British cartographer's interpretation of Cartier's third voyage is that he wants to avoid Hochelaga because he's afraid he upset them last time, especially by kidnapping people. So he wanted to avoid Hochelaga, but he was also motivated by looking for gold, and he was told by, I believe it was Chief Donnacona, before he kidnapped him, that, and it was probably a ploy to get him to leave their country, is that if you go to this fabled place called the Saguenay, there's riches beyond belief there. So he had it in his head that beyond the rapids and beyond the lake that's after the rapids would lead to the Saguenay, this place where there was gold. So he very much wanted to go past the rapids, but the rapids were impassable, right? So he docks the ship, and they get out in dinghies, and they go to the mainland, and right in the area of one of our previous settlements, there's a village there, a village of 400 people, and they're close to a tributary that leads into the St. Lawrence. Turtle River. So
around Kanien'kehá area.
And they're well received by the people on the South Shore. Well received. And they say there's a lake. There's a lake that is beyond the rapids, Lac St. Louis, or whatever you want to call it. And maybe they thought that, as it leads to the Ottawa, maybe that's the path to the Saguenay.
Yeah.
So they travel by land, and once they pass the rapids, they're escorted by these people who live in this 400-person village into the lake. And they say that they've come across another hamlet of people that live next to another tributary, the Wolf River. So, and I remember Billy saying that this is something that he heard from his father. So, so it sounds like this story almost substantiates, that story. But again, none of those villages were Kahnawà. It was all Kahnawà. That this area, this region, this country was probably called Kahnawà.
Yeah.
So let me see where I'm at. Morgan referred to this area. We talked a little bit about the valley, the villages in the valley that were named Kahnawà, which begs the question. Okay, and
this is down
in the valley, Mon Valley.
Valley.
But I'll get to that. What we were talking about earlier. The question is, well, why did we leave?
Yeah.
Why did we leave this area? If our ancestors, if the ancestors of the Kanien'kehá occupied this land, why did we leave? So there's a story that's pretty prevalent in historical record. Prevalent, I'll say, like I've come across maybe 4 or 5 different versions of the same story, and coincidentally, it's a story that Billy Two Rivers tells. And the first one that I had become aware of was from Cadwalader Colden, who wrote a book called History of the Five Nations in 1727. It's an old story.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the Lieutenant Governor of New York and Governor of New York at one time. So it was his business to deal with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy at that time. So presuming that he spent time with the people at that time, he's coming across these stories quite honestly. And what he says in his story is that it's known to all the people at that time, 1727, when he writes this, that the original homeland of the Five Nations was Montreal.
Yeah.
He says it's clear. He says, but then something happens where, and I might be getting some of the stories mixed up because there's differences in each version of the story, but they all boil down to the same thing. A group of Algonquins and a group of Haudenosaunee or Kanien'kehá on their own decide to go on a hunting expedition together. And sometimes it's described that there's it's a particularly rough winter, and that the people were desperate for game meat, and so it made more sense if the Algonquins and Haudenosaunee hunted together. They might be able to cover more ground and bring back more meat.
Mm-hmm.
So they go hunting together, and it says that they go hunting in the Adirondacks, which is we often look at as our hunting grounds.
Yeah.
And it happens that they break up into smaller groups of warriors or hunters to cover more ground. And it was a small group made up of so many Mohawks or Haudenosaunee. It depends on which version of the story, and Algonquin. And they said it was so rough that the Algonquins ended up taking some of the bark, and they made a meal, like a flour out of it, and they ate it. And that's where the word Adirondack comes from, the Adirondacks. They were eating the bark. So one version of the story says that there was 6 Kanien'kehá or Haudenosaunee and 6 Algonquins. And they started getting on each other's nerves, it sounds like, and that the Algonquins were very proud hunters because they weren't farmers like we were. They weren't horticulturalists like we were, and they were very boastful about how good hunters they were. But the Kanien'kehá went off on their own, and when they came back with meat, and Algonquins were so insulted and jealous by what happened that they decided to kill these Kanien'kehá in their sleep, and they buried their bodies in the snow. And when they only discovered their bodies in the spring when the snow had melted, but before that had happened, these Algonquins returned back to the main group, and they reported back to the main group that we don't know what happened to these men. They disappeared while we were hunting. We went off on our own and they disappeared. But the Algonquin chiefs knew something was up, and I don't know if they confessed to them, but they found out what the truth was. And the Algonquin says, once the Iroquois find out about this, we're finished. And the only chance we have is to launch a surprise attack against their villages, because if they know we're coming, or if they find out about this, they're coming after us. So their response was to launch a surprise attack on the villages at Montreal. So, and they dispersed so they successfully push these villages out. And the cool part of this story is that Billy Two Rivers tells the same story. And he says that this is an oral tradition, but it's very possible that his father or his grandfather read the Cadwalader Colden book, since it was published in 1727, and got his information from that. Or maybe not. Maybe it's an active tradition that is still alive in our community. But he says that it's an oral tradition that survived. And he says that those 3 villages that he described, the Bear Clan village, the Turtle and the Wolf Clan village, they were dispersed. And that's the reason why we call Montreal Tiohtià:ke, because the Onujokjagun was where the group broke into two pieces.
I was gonna.
And he says that half the group went to Vermont, and half the group went into the Mohawk Valley and joined their kin that were there. So the villages that were called Kahnawà in the Mohawk Valley, is it possible that those were the refugees that came from here, and they retained the name of the country that they came from? So it's possible. But even more so, when we return to this area in 1667 and go to the settlement that was already created out of Prairie Gandage or Gandage or whatever you want to call it, when they split away from that and create their own village apart from the Prairie de la Magdalene, whatever it was called, that Jesuit retreat, what do they call it? Kahnawà. What do they call the subsequent villages? Are all variations of Kahnawà. And but why? Because the country was called Kahnawà. Just like we look at Kanien'kehá today, the modern village of Kanien'kehá, it's the name of the settlement, but it's the repossessed area of Kanien'kehá territory, meaning the country. It's the same idea. They probably just named themselves after the country. And but it wasn't necessarily a settlement. It's that we're living in the country of Kahnawà. And we see that repeated even in the 1800s, 1700s, when they start referring to this thing that's very popular, people are talking about today, is the Seven Nations of Canada. But often the Seven Nations were called the Kahnawà Nation or Kahnawà Nation. And one phrase I saw was the Seven Tribes of Kahnawà. Sure, Kahnawà was the central council fire of this alliance. But why did they call it that? It was probably because the St. Lawrence was called Kahnawà, and that was still subconscious in their subconscious. As part of their history.
And
that's amazing.
That is a really good take.
It is.
Let's just put it as a really good take on it, because I go back to what I said earlier about it. It was often something when I first saw those names, and then it hit me. I had always heard there was one, but I didn't realize there were three. When I saw that map, you had
in the valley there were three Kahnawà, and they all led to each other. They retained the name Kahnawà for each of those villages. And the people that left that last Kahnawà in 1790, what was it? 1793 maybe, when they came up here, they called themselves Kahnawà again.
It just makes a lot of sense, putting the geography together, the change, but not so that it wouldn't be the dominant feature, the rapids, the Kahnawà. And again, if you've ever gone down the Mohawk River, where's the rapids? That little,
That's a good point.
I'll share just a little bit of an epilogue to this Algonquin story about how we were pushed out of this.
That was a good story
country.
too.
But it's not over because, like I said, it's very well substantiated in different historical texts. This a variation of this Algonquin story. There's a French fur trader in the 1700s named Nicolas Perrault. He tells almost identical that story, except he says that the Iroquois were invited by the Algonquins to spend the winter with them to learn how to be the best hunters, and then when they outshone the Algonquin hunters, they killed them. The story appears more than once in the historical record. Apparently, still alive in somewhat in oral tradition. But one cool, I'll describe it as an epilogue. There was an amateur ethnologist and philanthropist named Harriet Maxwell Converse in the late 1800s. She comes to Kahnawà in 1902 because she heard that a wampum belt was discovered. And it was discovered in a stone house, and that this family removed the stone from their wall, and they found a wampum belt coiled up behind a rock. And
she'd heard this story.
She heard that this wampum belt was discovered,
so she wanted to.
And she's a collector, a philanthropist, and an amateur ethnologist, historian, whatever you want to call it. But she's collecting items all over the place, and she hears of this item and she wants to buy it. So she comes to Kahnawà and she buys this wampum belt. And the wampum belt, it's a war belt, has a hatchet on it, and it even still has some of the red paint that was on it, meaning that it was in use at one time. So she discovers a story that goes along with the belt. And it's recorded, the story, but it never says where she got the story. If somebody from Kahnawà told her the story, if she had somebody else say, oh, I know what this belt is. She doesn't really say, but there's a story that's attached to it. And it says that belt, which was used at one time to signify war between the Confederacy and the Algonquins, was used in the peace of 1671 when our wars with the Algonquins had subsided. And it says in that story that 6 hatchets were buried at Kahnawà in 1671, and that's when this belt was, they wiped the paint off the belt to say that the war was over. So what did the 6 hatchets represent? Of course, Converse says, well, it's for the 6 nations. Oh, 5 nations plus 1.
Yeah.
Saying like the 5 nations and maybe for the Algonquin. I think that's what she says. But was it the 6 hunters
That's what I was thinking.
that were originally killed
Yeah.
from Kahnawà?
Yeah.
And that's why they're buried in Kahnawà.
Yeah.
And that's why the belt was held in Kahnawà.
Yeah.
I mean, this
is
is all
the
speculation.
theoretical-
It fits a lot of the information.
Yeah.
We'd never know if that's the fact or not.
No.
But pretty cool if
It's
it was.
pretty cool.
Though, right?
Yeah. It is pretty cool.
It's the beginnings of a book.
Oh yeah. It's funny, Harley. It's funny you mentioned that. It's funny you mentioned that because one of the historians, I forget if he's an ethnologist or what his real academic profession was, but there was a guy named William Lighthall. In the turn of the century, he wrote a number of articles about Hochelaga and about about how the original inhabitants of Montreal were Hurons / Iroquois or just ancestors of the Haudenosaunee nations. In the early 1900s, he writes a play.
Oh yeah.
About all of this.
Really?
I think I told you about that.
Yeah,
right?
you did tell me about that. Yeah,
But
that's right.
but the funny thing is, the Culture Center produces this book, and I never really took it seriously because it seemed like a really over the top way that was written right early 1900s, like 1904, 1903, and it was, if I remember correctly, it was a play that was done on the shore of a river. I think there was one that was further down. Maybe like in Halifax or something like that. They had a barge, and they would have the performance on the barge. Maybe they had one that was here too, but it was like a play that was on a barge, and it was called and it was called Hiawatha the Mohawk.
Oh yeah.
And so like I dismissed it. Like I've been working here now for 17 years, right?
Yeah.
This book it's so inconvenient because we have so many of these books that nobody likes. Nobody wants this book, so we have to move them all the time. But one day I looked at it and I said, hey, William Lighthall. In my research, I discovered that this guy is like supports a lot of the idea that our ancestors were from Montreal.
Yeah.
So I started looking at
Dig
it.
a little,
And you know what? It's the whole story. It's the same story. It's over the top, and it's written like a play,
theatrical.
But it starts with a celebration takes place in Montreal, and Chief Hiawatha, and I think his name was Black Wolverine, was the chief of the Algonquins, and they have a canoe race. Who's the faster canoeer? And it might have been Hiawatha himself, but one of the Iroquois anyway. They have this race with Black Wolverine or one of the Algonquins, and Iroquois win. And then they say, well, you know, it was nice. It's a celebration commemorating the peace between the Algonquins and the Iroquois. So, or the Kanien'kehá, I think it's specifically the Kanien'kehá. Yes, it's specifically the Kanien'kehá, not the Iroquois. So it says there that after the race was done, this Black Wolverine says, yeah, maybe you are better canoers than we are, but not better hunters. The Algonquins are better hunters than the Kanien'kehá are. So they say, so he challenges the Kanien'kehá to a hunting contest. And so they agree, and the same thing, they go into the Adirondacks, and the same, just like these stories that are in the historical record, which he's probably he's aware of. That's why he's writing the story.
Right.
But he tells the story that the Kanien'kehá win the hunting contest, and they're killed by jealous Algonquin hunters, and they attack Montreal and force the Kanien'kehá out of the Montreal area.
There you go.
Into the Mohawk Valley, and that's where they first meet the Oneida, Onondaga, and the other nations, and they only form the Confederacy at that point. And from that point on, it tells a story of the formation of the League.
What year did this guy write this play, roughly? Ballpark.
1704, 1709, like around that
so
time.
it's pretty early still, in the colonial kind of...
No, sorry, I got 19. Sorry,
19. Oh.
My mistake.
That's
it's
what
later.
I thought.
1904.
Something.
Sorry, I inverted the number.
So this guy's getting this...
He probably
he's heard it in the 18 whatever.
He probably read
Colden.
Colden. He probably read this Nicolas Perrault.
Regardless,
probably read that.
And who knows? And he
stories,
spoke to people. Who knows?
Like all stories.
But it's funny that you mentioned it could be a movie, because this guy wrote it into a play. He just made it
a lot of
The interesting thing is that he ties it to the formation of the Confederacy. And if that is the timeline, we probably wouldn't like that, because it makes the establishment of the Confederacy a lot later than we probably thought or hope it is. If it's after Cartier, because this is supposed to be in the time of Cartier that the people were dispersed.
But then of course, what do you call it? Authors. What's that? I can't think of the term where
they're taking liberties.
Taking liberties to come up with this story that kind of can pull in as many people and interest as many people. A bigger audience, reach with bigger audience.
But
it's for the time.
But it's supposed to match the reason why when Champlain comes in 1603 that there's nobody left in Montreal. Why are there no people here anymore? This is supposed to substantiate why there's no people at Montreal, because the Algonquins pushed them out. But nobody will ever know that.
One reason. There could have been others, but that's one war conflict. That's again, it goes back to motivation. We're trying to dig up what are the possible motivations on all of these things that you've talked about or we've talked about. It always goes back to that. Is like why? What was the climate? What was the climate in terms of political too, economic too, and just
So I guess what this all boils down to is that the original people who lived along the St. Lawrence weren't so much a distinct Iroquois nationality that were separate from the Kanien'kehá and the Haudenosaunee nations, but more that the people who lived here were here so long ago that it predates our identity as Kanien'kehá. Which is hard to fathom to begin with. But that older nationality of Iroquois people that lived here, Kahnawà, if you want to call them, was so old it predates our identity as Kanien'kehá. If you look at that Lafiteau story about how they traveled up the St. Lawrence till they got to Quebec and made their way into Mohawk Valley or Kanien'kehá, that didn't take place in 2 weeks.
No.
That could have been over hundreds and hundreds of years that this story is kept alive. But if that's the case, that to me that's what it boils down to, is that it'll boil down to Montreal being our ancestral territory. So that's the way I would phrase it.
A lot of the things you talked about, the stories are about that, the splitting. So Chage, the
Yeah.
it's so interesting, and to hear the stories, and sometimes I would hear the story. Oh, just where did this come from? Where did this come from? There had to be some part of that story, that was real, and then somebody could have added a little to, pulled a little of this. But there's usually there is a reality part to
basis
to the
in
base
some kind
in something,
of fact.
and then they pull this and this
like
to make that story.
Of the Algonquins and that. I thought that it's being told over so many times. And there had to come from all stories, right? I mean, most stories, like especially
come from
even like you were talking about that story about the corn and that had some kind of basis in reality,
and that's really how I've been tempering the written record, is by looking at what do our stories say in conjunction to what we might consider scientific theory. Right. And seeing again what all fits together, matches. And right now, to me, that's what fits together. I might change my mind in 2 weeks or next month, but right now, that's where my mind is at. And so when we get people who contact us here at the Cultural Center to ask us for a land acknowledgement request, I'll tell them that this is the ancestral territory of the Kanien'kehá Nation, because it covers so many bases. So even if we didn't identify ourselves as Kanien'kehá at the time people were living here, it's still our ancestral territory. So it covers all our bases. But how do you explain that? Okay, we just spent, I don't know how long we've been chatting, an hour and a half, maybe almost 2 hours.
That.
So when somebody contacts us for a land acknowledgement request, it's clear, how do I condense that all into 2 sentences, because that's what they want. It's almost impossible. It's doing it injustice,
Yeah.
So
I could see your mind is.
I mean, part of it is who's got a better claim to it.
Yeah,
I'm going to say that too. That might be who has a better claim to it. I'm not saying that they don't, and they don't have some stories, but I'd like to hear it too. And I'm not challenging it in a confrontational kind of way.
That's
right. I'm saying that this is our story, and we're not looking to find out somebody. If someone says, "Hey, we got a story," I'd really like to hear that too.
I mean,
I'd like to hear, and there may be times when we had moved, like you said, and then it was occupied, and again, geographically, when you look at it, that whole thing, there's another people say it was a meeting area. Yes. It does make a lot of sense. Sure. It does. Yeah. Again, geographically, looking at the time, it was on the superhighway, right in the middle. You talked about there's a mountain in the middle of this island. The river goes and splits like this. It's the makes border. A lot of sense. It's a border.
It's the border, because you have Algonquins to the north and the Iroquois speaking peoples to the south.
And it would be a good opportunity to for whether it be big gatherings to discuss whatever, to come together, to exchange to trade, and
I think on I saw
and
that
on and
recently.
on and on.
People were talking about that. Like
that would make sense too. So to try to just say it's just this, and it was always this like that. I think it was very fluid. That depending on the time, but I still feel that that we have the. As far as I'm concerned, because I haven't heard any other, the strongest.
I would say that Montreal was under the auspices of our ancestors, but it was probably a diplomatic and trade hub for all different nations, which would explain why Cartier is hearing more than one Iroquois language being spoken at the time, right?
Right.
There's more to that Hochelaga thing I wanted to share.
Even that word Hochelaga, where is I hear different things where
but that's the French.
From.
That's the French kind of writing down.
but the original word.
But how it sounded and how it sounded to their ear, writing it down in the
the most.
There's a lot of different ones. I think we'll never know.
No, right.
But
exactly.
One is they'll say is I had a long talk with Garhoene about this, so I don't know if I'm getting the pronunciations right, but I know that there was a word that was akin to a beaver dam.
Oh yeah.
I think, and they were saying that it was Osirage or Osirage, not Osira, like
Yeah,
the word,
not
but
the word.
something to do with a beaver dam. And then I think it was Charlevoix in the 1740s says that he was talking to people who said that Hochelaga meant, so if the suffix Haga was people of the, and that the mountain, Mount Royal, Onunda, because there's a word Onuncha'aga, and Charlevoix felt that that was the original word that was misinterpreted by the French as Hochelaga. And then there's some modern takes on it too, about what it could mean. Like what was the one that I had heard? Ozahakta, next to the fire. Yeah, that might have been the name, meaning the council fire that was there.
It's hard to know. We can't really know for sure.
Yeah, I'm not fresh on it either. But
no.
But then what I'm writing on, what I've been writing, I do have a chapter that's all about the theories around Tiohtià:ke and Hochelaga. Yeah, maybe we could do another segment just on
probably,
that.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah.
But I guess that's as far as I could take it today. But I guess if I were to boil it all down again, that the St. Lawrence River, Montreal are all a part of our ancestral homelands, our ancestral territory.
And then the part we really didn't get into much, and that is the discussion, and it's a totally different, it's more of a political discussion in terms of, well, what's their motivation to say it's not, to dispossess us? And I think we know, but again,
I think we know. Yeah.
What is, from our point of view, there's no...
It's the cleanse title.
Yeah.
It's meant to cleanse title.
I guess that's
the
one way
land.
to put it. Yeah.
So they could, they're not.
Yeah, there was no one here. The terra nullius, all of that, and it's just it goes back to that essentially. Yeah, our hands are clean. We came in and there was nobody in the room.
Yeah, right.
Nobody occupying the house, whatever.
That's
that. Putting it that way, I think is, and I go back to saying, who's got a better argument for it than we do?
So I've been writing this all down. I know that in my written version, there's a lot more. I go into a lot more detail in a lot of things that we discussed. I hope maybe this year I'll be able to finish up that book, and it would be available through the Cultural Center. It would be a Cultural Center publication. Yep.
Well, that was pretty. I know I was silent for the most parts because I was really just I was just retaining a lot, and I think everybody else is going to really enjoy, retain all that too. And
it's a controversial topic, right?
But like you were saying, and I know you've said this many times, but we do have to have people have to have more discussions about things that maybe sometimes you might find uncomfortable, or push somebody else's thoughts a little bit further or something. I mean, that's what I think.
So many people enjoy having these types of discussions, but a large part of the population of our community and maybe don't feel like that's something. And I think part of it is just to try to engage them at another level. Like maybe you might have a talk on this somewhere, but it's in the middle of winter. I'm too lazy to go out. I'll be straight. Right. I'd go, it's cold out. It's -20. Yeah, I got to take care of this, and I got to stay here to do this, and I got to cook supper. Well, you got this type of a forum as a media to do that, and then people can just
push this conversation
and be doing their supper and not in their warm house and stuff like that, and listening, and that maybe that's where those conversations have to happen.
Part of them.
You know,
Yeah,
partly,
sure.
partly, at least the start of them, at least
Ignite them.
Educating more
Yeah.
people about it so that you can have a more informed.
To get one person that's
Type
gonna,
of,
you know, maybe one
discussion.
person listen to it. Oh, I didn't
Yeah.
know that.
Yeah,
I
and
was
more,
sitting here
you
thinking
build
that
on that.
maybe the whole
Yeah.
time. I was
Yeah.
like, kind of just retaining it all, and being like,
Yeah.
some of it was really giving, you know, I was, as you were talking, I was like getting chills about some things because I was like, it's right, you know, and I
Yeah.
was like, he's right, like it makes a lot of sense,
Yeah.
but yeah, well, no, go,
Yeah.
they used it.
Yeah. My
And,
pleasure.
but
And I'm glad you were able to make
I
it
know,
with
yeah.
us.
He had a dirty shirt
Yeah.
on, and he
Yeah.
wasn't gonna come because of that.
He just be I didn't
And he was-
it's peanut
He
butter.
spent like 20 minutes going cleaning
and
the
I
bathroom.
realized I ran.
Yeah,
I wasn't going because I had something else, and in the end, it's okay. Time works for me
yeah.
now.
But he got here, and I
Yeah.
think you added to it, and I appreciate it. So
Wasn't
yeah,
fun.
Nyawa. So I think
now,
we could probably cut it there. Or it's good.
all right.
Yeah, good. That was good.
Yeah.
That was good.